Good afternoon. I'm Gina Keller. I am the director for the Commonwealth Learning Partnership, and we are working together very closely with truly fabulous educators across Virginia to recognize how important it is to be learners in this time. In the midst of chaos, being able to find the good. And today, I believe that you are going to leave with a bit of a changed soul and a changed mindset and even a deeper love for the children that you see in those faces that you see virtually or face to face, and the families we serve across Virginia. I'm going to go ahead and jump in and start by introducing Janice View from George Mason University, and then Janice will they have a way to introduce their team. I'm not going to dictate how that happens because we do want to jump in. We have breakout sessions for you today, lots of opportunities for discussion and questions, and really bringing the likes of you. I don't want to overuse it, but you really are champions for our children and their families in Virginia, and we appreciate it. It's so important. It's always been important. I would say it's of utmost importance in the times that we have faced over the past year to be reintroduced to the why, to our why. So with that, I welcome Janice, if you would take it from here. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you so much, Gina. And it's quite an honor to be here to meet with these wonderful educators from across the Commonwealth. Janice View recently retired from George Mason University, sharing this process with my beloved colleagues, Dr. Elizabeth DeMulder, Dr. Stacia Stribling, Laura Dahlman, and one of the graduates of our program, Lauren Rodriguez-Gregg. You'll get a chance to meet with all of us later as we get into the breakout rooms. And especially you'll hear from Lauren Rodriguez-Gregg as we orient a lot of this conversation around her and her story. We want to start with a land acknowledgement, understanding that land is not merely space that our bodies occupy, it's also a repository of culture, story, history, and tradition. And as such, we want to start our presentation by sharing a land acknowledgement statement for the land on which we have the privilege of living and working. At the place George Mason University occupies, we give greetings and thanksgiving to these Potomac River life sources, to the Dogue ancestors who Virginia annihilated in violent campaigns while ripping their lands apart with the brutal system of African-American enslavement, to the recognized Virginia tribes who have lovingly stewarded these lands for millennia, including the Rappahannock, Pamunkey, Upper Mattapony, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Nansemond, Monacan, Mattapony, Patawomack, and Nottoway, past, present, and future, and to the Piscataway tribe who have lived on both sides of the river for time immemorial. We are here to talk about a book, but also beyond the book, that was written and published by my colleagues at George Mason University. It's called Anti-Racist Professional Development for In-Service Teachers. And I want to give a bit of context really about why we decided to do the book in the first place. It started with our work as professional professional development, teacher educators working with in-service teachers. And we did a survey, it was a national survey actually, with a great number of responses from Virginia. And we posed the question, what does good, high quality professional development look like from the perspective of classroom teachers? And so in the next slide, it shows some of the elements of that kind of professional development. People wanted something that they could use immediately. They wanted something that was culturally relevant. They wanted materials that treated them as intellectuals. And it was also in the context of Virginia, that's 40th in the US in terms of state funding for public education on a per pupil basis. And the fact that Virginia teachers are paid less than the national average for their work. So in that context, teachers were not satisfied with the professional development they were receiving, had really clear ideas about what high quality PD looks like, and also are not necessarily valued in terms of money by the Commonwealth of Virginia. And in the next slide, we show that over 20 years of our experience in this master's degree program for in-service teachers, that teachers really wanted collaboration with their colleagues. They wanted effective test preparation was not what they are looking for in professional development. They wanted opportunities for self-reflection, and in particular, they wanted opportunities for culturally relevant learning how to build and teach culturally relevant lessons. So the book that we wrote was in response to an urgent call for the reprofessionalization of the classroom teachers and for anti-racist education in public schools. There are 4 essential themes from the book: identity work, unpacking assumptions, the importance of relationships, and a focus on policy. I'll talk a little bit about each one of those things, but more importantly, Lauren Rodriguez-Gregg will talk from her own experience about what it was like to be in such a program, receiving that kind of professional development that uplifted these 4 themes, and what it's meant for her practice. So in terms of identity work, one of the first things we do immediately, first day of the program, is to help teachers understand who they are in front of their students. They're not automatons, they're human beings, fully formed human beings with behaviors, worldviews, attitudes, actions, dispositions. And they also come as people who are raced, who are gendered, who have class identities. And it's important from the outset to understand who we are as educators in a classroom space before we even have the conversation of who our students are, right? If we have a clear sense of our identities, it allows us then to be listening differently, to be watching, to be learning, to fill in our own educational gaps about who the students are before us and how we can best uplift their excellence and their brilliance. So identity is a really important piece. And nationally, most classroom teachers are white, middle-class women. And most of the public school students in our schools are increasingly kids of color: African-American, Latinx, Indigenous people, Asian people, people from other parts of the world who don't look white. And so what does that mean for how we teach and learn? And so identity is a signature part. Next, we look at assumptions. We look at what it is that we think we know about ourselves, what we think we know about our students, what we think we know about teaching and learning, what we think we know about our content areas. And how do we pick those apart, look at them differently, to really understand that as the slide said, assumptions are leadership quicksand, right? It can suck you in and you can't get out. But apart from just examining assumptions, it's also about taking action. Once you have a new understanding about an issue, an area, how do you take action to do repair work where it's necessary, or to change things or move things in a different space so that all of the students in our classrooms are learning? Another piece of this is building relationships. We can have people who are tremendous content specialists who can know their content extremely well, but if they don't figure out how to make that content connect with the students in their classroom, with their lives, their concerns, their families' concerns, their cultures, their languages, then there's a loss that occurs in terms of the delivery of content. And also, relationships help build trust, help build the socio-emotional learning that we talk about for schools, where kids feel like school is a safe space. School is a nurturing space. School is a space where they can grow and develop and make mistakes without harming themselves or others, and learn from those mistakes. But that only comes from trust in relationships. And then finally, one of the hallmarks of what our teachers said to us in the survey was important for high quality professional development, but we've also learned in our own work, is having an understanding of educational policy is really important. So in the book, we talk about Ibram Kendi's work around anti-racism, and we take it to another level. We say that while, yes, he says that racism only gets dismantled when we engage in policy work. We also understand that policy comes in many forms. What we call small p policy, which in this case is what happens inside of the schoolroom, the schoolhouse, the classroom doors. What's sort of smaller, not necessarily an impact, but in contrast with what we're calling big P policy. So things that happen outside of the school building that infiltrate the schools. So, the extent to which there's an insistence on standardized testing, or that there are legal policies that impact the way we engage with kids with special needs, or legislative agendas that determine what happens inside of the school spaces. Having teachers have an understanding of those policies seems really essential, not only for developing their own leadership, but also taking an anti-racist stand, to understand that these are structures that have been around for more than 400 years that we are attempting to dismantle. It will take maybe not 400 years to do so, but that it's going to require an attention to the systems issues, in addition to the curricular issues, in addition to the interpersonal relationship issues. And so with that, I am very pleased to introduce you to Lauren Rodriguez-Gregg. She's an elementary instructional facilitator and coach. She's an equity lead. She is a former elementary school teacher. She's a graduate of the Transformative Teaching Program in 2018. And as she likes to let everyone know, she is a lifelong learner. And so I am very excited to share her with you. We've always enjoyed her as a student and as a colleague, and now we will let her tell her story. Lauren, it's on you.
Thanks, Janice, for the very gracious introduction. So at its very simplest and most powerful level, education is about truly seeing the kids before us. This seems so simple and so obvious, yet as we know, sometimes other aspects of education like the curriculum, data, testing, planning, evaluations might get in the way. So today I'm here to tell you the story of my transformational journey to really seeing the kids. And I'm Lauren Rodriguez-Gregg, and as Jenny shared, I'm an instructional facilitator, equity lead, and all of the other things here on the slide. And I'm very glad to be here today. Lauren, next slide, please. I was raised in a multicultural and bilingual home, surrounded by literature, love, different languages, and of course, lots and lots of learning. My parents worked hard to instill in me from a very young age the value of open-mindedness and acceptance for others, and every day showed me the magic of being around those who are different from me. I wanted to go into the teaching profession so that I could instill these same values in my future students. Next slide. When applying for teaching jobs right out of college, it was important to me that I work at a school that served a diverse population of students and families. And I felt very honored to begin my teaching career at a Title I school in Fairfax County. During my first few years of teaching, I discovered that learning happens only when strong relationships are built and when the classroom feels safe and supportive for students and their families. I learned that relationships like these take time. So with my students, I implemented strategies from Responsive Classroom, including morning meeting, different types of teacher language, closing circles, and lots of activities dedicated to community building. So here on this slide, you can see my students playing team relay races and tug of war games while cheering each other on, and then using a little puppet for a morning meeting greeting. For my students' families, I wrote weekly newsletters, offered optional weekend field trips, served as a spectator at students' games and recitals, opened my classroom to their visits, and offered much of my time outside of the school day to communicate with them, as all teachers do. I learned that building these relationships can present challenges that took me far outside of my comfort zone. I'll never forget a conference I had with a parent who didn't speak English and an interpreter who did not arrive on time. I used my rusty Spanish to communicate with the parent about her child's successes as well as areas for growth. And by stepping out of my comfort zone, I created a safer space for that parent and for that student. As all have experienced and know, each school year's end was bittersweet. Bitter in that I had to say goodbye to the students and families with whom I'd formed such strong connections, and sweet in that I knew my students were ready for what was to come, academically and, to me, often more importantly, socially and emotionally. All right, Lauren. Thank you. When I learned about the transformative teaching program at George Mason through an email from my principal, I knew it was the right program and the right time for me. I started during the summer between my 4th and 5th years of teaching, and I didn't realize at the time that life would never be the same, and I haven't ever looked back. So like Janice mentioned, on the first day of class, we started to unpack the concept of identity, something I realized I hadn't really put much thought into. At the time, I knew that being female meant something to me, and I identified with being a Cuban American, but I never really considered what that meant for me as a person or educator, family member, or friend. We did an identity web that day, and we read about racial identity development. I really had no idea that there was so much that made up our identities. I reflected on this activity that week, and here's an excerpt of what I wrote. Next slide, thanks. So this is from that first day of class. I'm just a person. While I know my race is white, I also feel that my color doesn't define me. I am just a person, and others around me are just people too. I remember growing up and learning from an early age that the way we look, the food we eat, the traditions we practice, the beliefs we hold, and the way we dress don't define a person. A person is defined by their actions, words in whatever language, dispositions, and relationships with others. So at that time, I really had been transformed around the concepts of racism and racial identity. I had sort of started the program thinking like, I'm a teacher, I came from this multicultural home, I'm not affected by that. And now, almost 5 years later, I am even more transformed. I, of course, now know that my race is a huge part of my identity. It's privileged me in ways I may not ever know, and my dispositions, actions, language, and character come second when meeting someone new. It's taken a lot of time and deep reflection to learn about and accept these things, and I'm better for it. Next slide, please. So at the beginning of the transformative teaching program, like I alluded to a moment ago, despite the way I was raised to value diversity and inclusion, I thought that going into my classroom with a somewhat colorblind approach was the right thing to do. I talked with my students about how being different is wonderful, and we read stories like the ones on the screen, whoever you are, and same but different, but I didn't go much further than that. I learned very quickly that I was in fact further marginalizing the already marginalized groups by overlooking and at times ignoring their histories, experiences, perspectives, and identities. We learned in class that many white teachers hold this ideal, that colorblind teaching is the right way, because talking about race can be so uncomfortable. Next slide, please. So once again, I stepped outside of my comfort zone in the classroom, and I deliberately engaged my young students in identity exploration. You can see some of their identity posters here. Not only did I discover that it wasn't as uncomfortable as I thought it might be, but I also saw the impact of this work. Students were thrilled to learn that they were from the same country as someone else, or that they had a similar hobby or spoke the same language at home. The relationships already formed throughout that entire school year were made infinitely stronger in just that one day. So now, as the instructional facilitator and coach and equity lead at my school, I collaborate monthly with a group of teachers on the equity committee. This is the first year that our school has an official equity committee, and the teachers who are members are very, very passionate about this work. During a recent committee meeting, the teachers engaged as students in a lesson around identity. They reflected on the possible impact of doing something like that in their classrooms, and they were challenged to bring this idea back to their teams. Then all of the classroom teachers in the school were invited to do this work with their students. So this is a baby step, and I'm excited to share that we've already seen a shift in the thinking on part of many teachers. So I'm going to share a few of the reflections that teachers shared after their lessons. Next slide. So I used to think my students would be unable to fully understand a lesson centered around identity. Now, I think this lesson gave my students an opportunity to connect through their similarities and differences. I used to think you don't talk about race and differences. Now, I think you can do it without offending others. I used to think my students were too young to talk about identity. Now, I think talking and learning about identity is an integral part of your classroom community. It needs to be incorporated into daily conversations in an authentic way. I used to think elementary students only attributed parts of their identities to their personality or interests. Now, I think elementary students have a broader understanding of their identity, specifically in regards to their beliefs and how they see the world. I used to think that students already knew who they were. Now, I think students are still figuring it out and are also changing over time. And the list goes on. As you can see, just from this one experience of teaching this identity lesson with their students, teachers saw how powerful that really could be. So by continuing to explore my own identity development and providing opportunities and space for others, students and colleagues alike, to explore theirs, I'm getting closer to truly seeing the kids, their families, and my colleagues. Next slide. So this brings me to the next big aha I experienced along my journey. Betsy, Janice, and Stacia challenged us to explore the concept of assumptions, like Janice mentioned before. As you can imagine, this was not easy. We dove deep into perspective work, we uncovered our own biases, and we learned the importance of examining and unpacking our own assumptions. We learned about the different types of assumptions and engaged in the critical reflection process, which is pictured here. It was hard to admit that I had made assumptions about students, parents, colleagues, family members. And at the same time, by admitting this not only to myself, but my transformative teaching cohort, I was able to grow. The relationships fostered with my cohort made it feel okay to share things I wasn't proud of. In the program, we did more than simply learn about concepts like this. We dove deep, we challenged ourselves and each other, and we came out on the other end more conscious and aware. The learning I experienced in the program very quickly started to trickle into my daily teaching practices and my interactions with others at school. So at first, I'd kind of catch myself thinking or saying something about a student or colleague or parent and privately check those assumptions just on my own. Then I began to acknowledge my own assumptions out loud to my teammates to sort of check myself in that way. And as time passed and this practice just became more of a part of who I was, I began to gently challenge these statements when they were said by other people. And I am now 5 years later, I still make assumptions and I still have to check myself, and I'm just more comfortable with it. It's just a part of life. So as a coach in my current role, I do my best to presume positive when working with others. And if I hear someone say something that might stem from an unchecked assumption, I remind myself to ask mediative questions and respectfully engage them in dialogue around the topic. By examining my own assumptions, I'm giving myself a better chance of really understanding the kids, their families, and my colleagues. Next slide, please. So throughout my time as a student in the Transformative Teaching Program, I engaged in a number of different action research projects in my own classroom. I started with topics that felt relatively safe to me, like collaborating with another teacher to increase the homeschool connection and implementing flexible seating, as you can see here. For my big end of program project, I really wanted to push myself once again to go outside of my comfort zone. Next slide, please. So I decided to facilitate a youth participatory action research project with my 5, 6, and 7-year-old students, most of whom were English learners. Based on the research at the time, I could not find any published evidence of this type of project being done with students so young. The project brought together so much of what I had learned. I had to put aside any assumptions or beliefs that young children may not be as capable of doing certain things as older children are. I had to focus on relationship building more than I ever had before if I was going to challenge the kids to do this hard work. And I had to take what I had learned about culturally relevant pedagogy and put it into action with this project. The students really amazed me every day, and I'll never forget when Janice told me that I and my students could do hard things. This has become a back pocket motto for me as I continue along my transformational journey. It was really hard supporting these young learners with data collection and analysis, as you can see here, all while continuing to teach the required state and county curricula. But through this project, every child in my class had access with appropriate scaffolds to deep learning, critical and creative thinking, problem solving, application. This project alone was transformational, not only for them, their self-esteem, communication skills, social emotional well-being, but also for me as a teacher and, more importantly, a learner. Next slide, please. So now, almost 5 years later, I carry the same motto, "We can do hard things," with me each day. Teachers' plates are overflowing, especially during this time of crisis. Now, more than ever, education needs to experience a shift, all things done with an equity lens. It can often feel like this is just another thing that a school or county or state is asking of teachers, when in fact it is the thing. As I work with teachers, teams, my school's administration, and other colleagues in the county, I challenge myself to bring this equity lens to all that I do. It's not easy at times. It's often uncomfortable. But I work hard to build relationships and honor the time it takes to do so that the hard work can be done. By doing hard things, stepping outside of my comfort zone, I'm better able to truly perceive the kids, their families, my colleagues, and help others to do so too. Next slide. So as I begin to wrap up, it is important for me to note that none of this learning could have happened without the time and consistency provided by the structure of the Transformative Teaching Program. As a member of a tight-knit cohort led by the same 3 professors over 2 years, I was able to step further out of my comfort zone than I ever thought possible. I formed strong bonds with my colleagues, and clearly I'm still in touch with my professors. The semesters were intentionally planned to build upon each other, and the time together made it possible for my transformation to begin. These things, time, relationships, identity, are particularly important for equity work. We have to be able to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and we can't get comfortable with being uncomfortable if we don't feel a sense of safety or connection with those around us, which of course takes time to build. Next slide, please. So in closing, my transformational journey is just that, a journey. For me, this type of growth, exploration, and deep reflection couldn't happen from a one-off workshop or professional development session. It's taken time, years, strong relationships, a willingness to confront challenges, and a recognition that growth comes out of mistakes and discomfort. My transformational journey that I'm still on today has allowed me to open my eyes so that I can see the kids, their families, and my colleagues. There is still much work to do, and it is possible when we can see the kids. Thank you so much.
So I think at this point, we are taking questions and maybe offering answers to folks before we move into the breakout space. Is that right, Lauren Stroop and Gina Keller?
Yes, ma'am, you are correct.
Should we ask people to post questions in the chat space and perhaps get some assistance monitoring that?
Yes, we can do that, Janice. This is Gina. If there are questions, yes, absolutely. Post your questions in the chat. I'll monitor it. I'm sure Lauren is looking as well. But I do want to say what a beautiful presentation, but really it's more than that. What a beautiful journey. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you, Lauren. There is a question.
Yeah, I think this is for you, Lauren. Yes.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to this. So the question was, can you talk about how your work was supported by building administration and how this was communicated to staff? So my administration was extremely supportive. Like I mentioned in my presentation, my principal was actually the one who shared with us about this program. So one of the projects that we did right off the bat was an equity audit, which involved us talking with many different teachers, collecting data about what's happening in the building. And so I believe I wrote kind of like a little blurb and had my principal read it over, explaining that I'm in this program, and that I may be, reaching out more than I normally would have to other teachers. So that's kind of how I communicated it, and I would include my admin so that they knew that it was supported by the building. I hope that answers your question.
There's another question for you, Lauren, about the equity group at your school.
Yep. So did I encourage an equity group at my school? So I work for Loudoun County Public Schools, and this is the first year that we have equity leads at each school. And it's encouraged that the equity lead either has a equity committee of teachers and educators within the building, or collaborates with the administration. So for us, I felt that it would be most beneficial for us to have a committee full of teachers who are in the building. So it was suggested by the county and then further developed within my school.
The question is about anti-bias and how it fits into the work. Part of the way the Transformative Teaching program was designed was to be sort of a 2-year-long anti-bias exploration, right? So it's not simply a training that happens one time, as Lauren mentioned when she talked about the kind of one-off professional development that teachers are often offered. But it's not to say that those are useless. It's to say that those are limited, right? And so we are talking about, again, sort of centuries old systems that have been in place that were not intended for most people. Most people, including women of all colors and people of color, were not expected to be educated, and most white men weren't expected to be formally educated, at least back in the very, very start of the Virginia colony. And so the fact that we have this evolving notion of who should be allowed to be educated, who should be allowed to have high quality education, who should teach students, et cetera, it's an evolving notion. And so it means a continuous exploration on the issues. The equity assessment is something that we do as we have used as an assignment early in the 2-year process, so that teachers continue to refer to it over the course of the 2-year cohort. You're gathering data about a variety of issues, looking to see where there might be disproportionate experiences for students. So for example, is it the case that most kids who are English language learners are showing up in the discipline data? Is it the case that there are not sufficient number of kids who are on free and reduced lunch who are in gifted programs? So where might there be inequities that are showing up in the data in your classroom, and also compared with the larger school district? And then how might you address those issues? It becomes an opportunity for multiple assignments over the course of the 2 years to explore that data.
And I think I can jump in about the question about assumptions. And hi, Laura, long time no see. So Tanya is asking about an example of assumptions or practical applications of how you make an adjustment to apply the equity lens. And what you were just saying, Janice, I think helps to understand that. So in the equity audit, if there was disproportionate number of kids of color, for instance, who were getting the brunt of the disciplinary responses, then looking at your assumption as a teacher about let me think about what's happening here when I see kids misbehaving in class. What is it I'm assuming about that? And so in order to unpack those assumptions, you have to talk with the kids who you're seeing as undisciplined, find out their perspectives about what's going on for them, talk with other teachers about what, their experiences, think about the literature on, for instance, the fact that kids of color are more often seen as being disruptive, and using all that to reflect on your own experience, your own identity as a person who has had experiences like this before or haven't, and So you're unpacking all of that, and then you're saying, okay, let me see if I can think about this differently and see how I can behave differently so that I'm always thinking, am I being equitable? Am I treating my kids in an equitable way? So that's one, I mean, just about anything you can think of that's an assumption you can unpack and say to yourself, is this equitable? Who am I judging harshly? Whose voice is heard and whose voice isn't heard in this conversation? So examining assumptions is a part that it's a habit of mind that we help to support teachers to really dig that in, and that's part of the reason time is so important and relationships are so important. It's not just a matter of a one-off hour-long workshop to say, okay, you need to examine your assumptions. There has to be lots of practice and skill building and, you know, applying it to your life in the classroom in scaffolded ways in order for it to really be an effective way to develop that habit of mind.
Right. And it also speaks then to policy, because if a teacher is doing this kind of action research to look at the data and look at his or her own assumptions, and then saying, perhaps there need to be some policy changes here about how we discipline kids. That is one of those examples of a small p policy that we talked about. It also could lead to sort of larger policy changes and shifts. And so sometimes teachers get afraid of this notion of, oh, policy, does that mean I have to go to Capitol Hill or to Richmond, or, you know, it's kind of big and scary. And it's like, there's policy everywhere. And so there are all kinds of opportunities to make those kinds of changes as well. Are there other questions before we move to the small groups?
I think there was, this is Stacia here, sorry, there was a second question that Susan, I think Janice, you addressed her first question about anti-bias, where that fits, but she also had another question wondering how to honor those that are further along their journey, which I think is important to speak to, because, you know, we do, in doing this work, we never make the assumption that people don't know anything about being anti-racist, right? Sorry, those are my dogs. And I think that part of that then fits into the relationships that we build with them, right? And that's where the relationships become so important. So we know the people that we're working with, we work with relatively small cohorts for that purpose, so that we can build those relationships and understand where people are and meet them in that space. Because there's always room for growth wherever they are, right? And so helping them figure out where is a good spot for you to push yourself in this work, where's a good spot where you can be in relationship with others in this cohort to help, you know, drive the conversation and the work that we're all doing together. Because it really is, you know, this isn't individual work, it's all about collaborating to make these changes. And so helping figure out where people are and meeting them there so that we can help everyone wherever they are on that road in their development and their journey.
Thank you for saying that, Station. I just want to put actually a finer point on this notion of people being farther along in the journey. You might assume, and maybe rightfully, that teachers of color have had a lot more experience tackling institutional racism, perhaps, maybe. It doesn't mean it's their job to do, and it's their job to teach other people in their space around that. It also may not be true that they're farther along, right? So making assumptions about who people are, what they know, what they bring to the table can be dangerous in terms of building strong communities that are anti-racist spaces. And so it's a delicate dance between the way you talk, Stacia, about people working together and coaching one another and helping one another along, and then putting the burden, if you will, on teachers of color and administrators of color. And so it's a very long and complicated process, but we can do hard things.